Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me, Philip Pugh, the Vice Master of Birkbeck, great pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the Orwell Memorial Lecture and tonight's speaker, Ferdinand Mount. Ferdinand Mount was editor of the Times Literary Supplement from 1991 to 2002. He was previously head of the Downing Street Policy Unit from 2002 to 2004. He has been a political columnist for The Spectator, The Daily Telegraph, and The Sunday Times, and a regular contributor to the London Review of Books and many other journals. His recent books include the novel The Condor's Head, Cold Cream, a best-selling memoir, and most recently, Full Circle, How the Classical World Came Back to Us. Now, I urge all of you, if you haven't already, to Google Ferdinand Mount and read Richard Davenport Heinz's review of Cold Cream. I'm going to give you a little taster to motivate you to do that when you get home tonight. Mount has been scrutinizing the great and the good with cheery bemusement. A menacing youth called David Cornwell teaches him German before becoming John le Carrier. He was had hauntingly early meetings with Siegfried Sassoon. John Betjeman takes him to an old-time music hall in Deptford, and Oswald Mosley muscles in on a boating holiday on the River Shannon. But what I liked most of all in that review, as an occupational psychologist, was that tucked away in the review somewhere, it said that Ferdinand Mount had never had to submit a CV for any of the positions that he ever took up. Instead, what he said was, I lived off the oxygen of influence. So tonight, I think we're going to hear more of that oxygen of influence. And ladies and gentlemen, I give you Ferdinand Mount and Orwell and the Oligarchs. Ferdinand.
Thank you very much, Philip, for that very kind introduction. It may have left a slightly misleading impression that I never filled in a CV. I filled in a great number of CVs for jobs I never got. Those jobs I got. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming, and I'm very honored and grateful to the trustees, the Orwell trustees, for asking me to give this talk. It's a particular treat for me because I have this very, very faint link with Orwell, who died when I was 10, I guess. When Animal Farm came out in 1945, my parents had an early copy. And a year or so later, after I'd learned to read, I picked it up, imagining from the title that it must be a book for children, although the grey and green cover and the lack of illustrations were not obviously alluring. And I read the book through almost without stopping. At first, as most readers are, enthralled by the heroism of the animals in breaking free of Mr. Jones, then disgusted by the treachery of Snowball and Napoleon. I was then surprised and a bit annoyed when my father told me that Animal Farm had a whole other meaning, which I was too young to understand. Regardless of this, my Aunt Violet, who was a great friend of Orwell's, reported to him how much I'd enjoyed the book, especially because there were no difficult words in it. And Orwell was delighted to hear that he had written so simply and clearly that a child of 7 could love the book. So tenuous though it is, I remain extremely proud of this link because it's a linguistic one. In a tiny way, I was living proof that Orwell had fulfilled his own injunction that prose should be like a window pane. It is this unremitting attention to language which is perhaps his most important living legacy to us. Many another writer on politics and literature has deconstructed the language of his opponents and pointed out the gap between their rhetoric and their real underlying motives. All of the great sages of the last 2 centuries, Burke and Marx and Nietzsche and the rest of them, tore off the masks of their enemies with gusto and venom, but they did not care to look into the mirror. Only Orwell, I think, consistently invites us to examine the hypocrisy of his own side, to chart between the gap between what they say and why they are really saying it. And it's remarkable, after all, that the great bulk of his essays and reviews are directed not against his enemies on the right, but against the people he worked with and the parties of the left, which he had belonged to and still did belong to. The Communist Party in Spain and elsewhere, socialists in general, the British Labour Party, and intellectuals of every sort. That his firepower should be so preponderantly aimed in that direction has led many people recently, long after his death, to deduce either hopefully or derisively that underneath he was really a sort of Tory. This seems to me a completely false deduction. Orwell adhered as firmly as any unquestioning loyalist to the Labour values of liberty and equality. He remained convinced that nationalisation was both desirable and inevitable. But he also believed that his own side was getting away with murder, often literally, and ought to be held rigorously to account. And this is why his memory is still green, why he remains revered long after the immediate provocations of his 2 great dystopian fables have slid over the horizon of history, at least for the time being. George Orwell revives in our own time the old Greek tradition of self-examination and self-criticism. He challenged us to stay alert to the potential or actual misuse of language by politicians, journalists, and academics. So we dare not treat his work as a monument, a completed thing to be inspected and admired. We've inherited a kind of ongoing project, work still very much in progress. For the Dictionary of Newspeak needs constant updating, and the Ministry of Truth is always hiring new spin doctors. So what is the self-critique that would be animating Orwell if he were with us today? In what ways would he say that we were deceiving ourselves and others about our current politics? These are alluring questions, but they're also dangerous questions. For in trying to identify what Orwell would have said if he were alive today, we are of course running precisely the sort of risks he warned us about, of telling it like we want it to be rather than how it really is. But my excuse tonight is that Orwell himself has pointed the general direction in which we should be ferreting and fossicking. I'd like to draw your attention in particular to his long essays on James Burnham, the highly influential writer who began as a Trotskyite in the 1930s and finished as a sort of early neoconservative in the 1960s. Burnham became famous for a book he published in 1941 entitled The Managerial Revolution. The book was subtitled What is Happening in the World. What it argued was that over a relatively short period, which Burnham dated from the First World War, a new society had emerged, and a new social group, the managers, was now engaged on a drive for social dominance, intending to exercise all the power and prestige that belongs to any ruling class.